Welcome to the Legacy Lifestyle Podcast. I got my lovely, I was going to say passenger, but that's not right. My lovely assistant. You're more than assistant.
I was going to say, I'm not Vanna White.
You're not Vanna White. No. And that's okay. I don't have any letters for you to turn anyway. My accomplice, partner in crime, just my wife. No, that's a full-time job. Jesse is here with me, and of course, this is kind of our thing. This Legacy Lifestyle Podcast. I've been thinking about this. By the way, first of all, got a little bone to pick with you. You let me walk out of the house this morning without my glasses. Yeah.
Oh, and that's my fault.
Well, I'm just saying, like, you're the one who looks at me like you couldn't say, like, hey, where are your glasses at?
Yep.
I'm just
totally
kidding.
Missed it.
I'm just kidding. I mean, it's not your fault, even though you got to look after me better than that. Otherwise,
well, I'll try better.
What have these 18 years been about? That's what I'm saying. But anyway, how you doing?
Doing good.
Yeah, you feeling good about what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah.
All right. We're kind of kicking off this. We've been talking a lot. First of all, we're just getting our feet wet, so to speak, with this whole legacy lifestyle thing. And we've kicked around so many things of like, well, should we do legacy marriage? Should we do legacy parenting? And of course, I'm finishing up a degree in leadership. And what I've really noticed is that leadership permeates into all of these things.
Absolutely. Well, and legacy is part of all of those things as
Absolutely.
well. So.
Yeah. And we've kind of made this statement that every leader leaves a legacy. Whether good or bad, wherever you're leading, you're going to leave something. You're going to make a mark on this dirt ball called Earth. Something's going to happen. And so our heart is really that we really believe life should be maximized. We believe that there's a God-given mandate for us to go out, to rule the earth, and not in some domineering way, but really as a way of promoting flourishing. And, as Christians, obviously that's the bedrock for us.
Yeah.
We believe in maximizing flourishing for all creatures,
Absolutely. And in a later episode, I think you're going to talk about just how God has kind of designed us to be brought back to Eden. Sorry.
Eden. Yeah, absolutely. And we've it's not a term that we came up with, but somewhere I know just in some of our studies, this idea of Edenizing the world, I would say that is the heart of legacy lifestyle. That is the heart of how can I look at my community? Can I look at my family? Can I look even where I work?
Right.
Whether I am the boss, whether I'm the CEO, or whether I'm low level, whatever. Any position you can influence, and so leadership does run kind of throughout all of this. So we're gonna run with themes of marriage, we're gonna run with themes of parenting and all this kind of stuff, because a lot of what we have to say, whether you're a parent, whether you're a boss or an employee or whatever, we believe that there's things that we're gonna share, that really can benefit anybody.
Absolutely.
Anybody can benefit from what we're talking about.
Especially in marriage, because it's so relational.
Yeah.
That I feel like if you just have good friendships, it would be good for you to just kind of listen, because you might learn something just about how to better communicate with your friend group.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. So that kind of segues into what we want to talk about today. We're looking at maybe creating this series on having difficult conversations or creating safe places for conversation, and we'll kind of unpack these as we go along. But in order to do this, years ago, I came across this quote. You're familiar with it, but a gentleman by the name of Ken Shimagatsu, he wrote a book called God in My Everything, and he just really talked about living this integrated life, not about just separating my life, but how do all these elements of my life flow together. And as you just kind of mentioned earlier, life is done in the context of relationships. We can't get away from it.
Absolutely.
We are relational creatures. And man, I tell you what, if the pandemic has exposed anything,
we need it.
We need it,
It's not just via Facebook or Zoom.
Yeah.
It's like we actually need contact with each other.
It's not good enough to have 500 quote unquote friends on Facebook or however many you may have or whatever. I'm not throwing an arbitrary number out there, but the reality is that we feel so connected. Mm-hmm. We feel connected, whether through technology. But the reality, get this, Jesse, in 1985, 1 in 10 North Americans reported no close friends.
Wow.
So in 1985, that's 10%. 10% of people, 10% of Americans said they had no close friends. 20 years later, so we're looking around 2005, what do you suppose that number went up to?
I don't know, like 5% maybe.
You think it went up maybe an additional 5%, so
Yeah.
somewhere around 15%? Well, actually, it went up to 1 in 4, which is 25%.
Oh my goodness.
25% of people
crazy.
reporting no close friendships. That's in 2005. That's just before the invention of the iPhone. We weren't even really fully,
Right.
into smartphone technology
Absolutely.
completely like the way we are today. So I can only imagine, how those stats have gone up since then.
Yeah.
But really, when it comes down to it, at the core of relationships, we got to get things right, because I think there's things in our culture where we've so isolated, and we can surround ourselves with voices that are telling us what we want to hear. Right?
Yeah.
Telling us what we want to hear. We can find our tribe. We can find this group online. And it makes us feel connected, but yet we need people who are willing to tell us
The hard thing.
what we need to hear, right? I mean, Proverbs says that faithful are the wounds of a friend.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be in a deep, meaningful relationship, there's going to be people who wound you. And many times, we're not talking about just people just,
Right. You don't want to railroad. Yeah.
Yeah. But we need people in our lives that are willing to tell us the hard things, that love us enough to do that, without their own personal agenda. We'll unpack more of this as we go along. But Ken Shimagatsu, I want to get back to this. He has this quote in this book. It says, what if, now this is in the context of relationships and specifically families. Okay. It says, what if God designed family both, so two things here, both as a community of joy.
Okay.
I like that. Okay. A community of joy, and as a furnace to shrink our selfishness, draw us closer to Jesus, and help us live and love well.
That second part's a little harder.
Yeah, we love the joy of community, right?
Right.
I got family members. Hey, it's great when you come over and stuff, but as long as the conversation's going a certain way, this is wonderful. But boy, you bring up certain subjects, and
Yeah, we're not going
that's
there.
time for you to go, right? You can move right along. But we need to talk about that.
Absolutely.
We need to talk about that because again, we can expand this beyond just family. We can expand this beyond marriages. I mean, we need coworkers who, see things and do we give permission for people? Now, sometimes people
Don't want to.
Yeah, or they don't honor that position well. Some people just, I just tell you what I think, and, they'll just come at you.
Yeah.
And we're not talking about that, but really we're talking about how can we establish healthy relationships where we can fully be ourselves.
Absolutely.
But also receive correction. And so there's a two-way street there. And so in order to do this, like really for the remainder of the episode, I want to focus in on this idea. A while ago, I've been really confronted with thinking about culture.
Oh,
right?
okay.
So this idea of culture. And culture, if you just boil it down to its basic definition, a culture is something that has a certain set of expectations, assumptions, values, okay? And you think about this. Like, so if I give you a few words here, if I say sauerkraut, Lederhosen, Volkswagen.
In Germany?
There you go, German, yeah. So, good job. Yeah, I totally put you on the spot there. Yeah, German culture. If I said something like tea and tea and crumpets and being all proper and
I would say English.
England, right? Yeah, sorry if you're
Or United Kingdom or whatever it is.
if you're offended by my stereotypes here. But the reality of it is that when it comes down to culture, we understand you cross certain borders. If you've been out of the country, quickly you can see there's other values, other assumptions.
I remember going to Honduras and like time is different there.
Yep.
Like you can say 5 o'clock.
Right.
But they may not get there until 5:30.
5:30, 6 o'clock, maybe 6:30.
I was like, there was a couple times where a church would start and 6:30 would roll around and people would be strolling in still. And so, it just was bizarre because we're so precise with our time here in the States.
It is certainly a value. And that's something, so cultures value different things, differently. And a lot of times, a lot of conflict that happens in relationships is when a value gets, trampled on or ignored or whatever. And I'll get to this just in a second here. But that's, we can look at cultures on a macro scale. We can see language, we can see a flag, we can see a national anthem. And those are like kind of these big things that are really easy to spot. But there's a lot of things about culture that are under the surface. If we imagine the iceberg, they say 80% of the iceberg is under the surface or whatever. Like culture, a lot of times it's more felt. You go into a culture, it's more felt. It's more like, I don't know if it's osmosis or whatever, but you kind of absorb these things. And what I want to submit today is that no matter what, no matter who you are, whether it's in your marriage, whether it's at your work or whatever, there is a macro culture. There are things that are really easy to see, but then there's also microcultures. And so, for example, in our marriage, for you and I, when we got married, I would say there were some macro things we had in common.
Absolutely. Like both of our dads, his dad works for the city and my dad works for the county. So very similar jobs.
Yep, blue collar jobs, right?
And then my stepmom and his mom are both hairdressers.
Yep.
And then I grew up like an hour away from you.
Yep, just down the road.
I'm from Kansas and he's Nebraska.
Nebraska,
and so our
way of life,
culture, and way of life around.
My dad coached wrestling for a few years, off and on, kind of through the years. He was an assistant coach. Your dad refed. He was a wrestling coach. He was a ref. Yeah. Your brother wrestled, was a state champion. Again, there were just similarities. We both come from very similar faith backgrounds, very similar beliefs.
I'm AG and
Assembly of God. My parents had a background in the Assemblies of God. Had attended Assembly of God churches.
Well, and even when we started discussing God and in our relationship, we realized that there was a lot of depth that was alike. Yeah. And even in our approach to God and how we worship. So.
Yeah. And one of the things I remember my dad, just growing up, it was one of these things where my dad just told me, he says, you need to find somebody. He says, listen, Kris, when you marry somebody, you marry the family.
You do, though.
You absolutely do.
Because they're involved in everything.
In everything, right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's a good thing. Again, back to the Shimagatsu quote here, right? What if, the problem is we don't like that furnace part. And we need to talk about that here in a second. But what's really interesting is on a macro level, you and I had a lot of things in common.
Yeah.
Our parents had similar work backgrounds, the different ways we were brought up, even down to like responsibilities, your parents saying things like, hey, if you've committed to an activity, you see it through, you don't quit something. I was told the same thing. And so church background, all this stuff. So these big, big things. So naturally getting married,
we'd be amazing.
Together, right?
Yeah. No fights.
No fights ever. Cause it's all
good.
It's all good. And that's how we've lived for the last 18 years. Why are you laughing?
Because that has not been the reality.
Was there a lot more iceberg beneath the surface? Is that what you're trying to say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Our first 2 years was a lot of furnace.
A lot of furnace.
Yeah.
So we should talk about that. So and really what we want to get at is a lot of times, again, whether you're working for an organization, whether you're entering into marriage, you can see the macro things
and
think, wow, this is going to work. This is going to be so great. And there are things at that macro level that help you enjoy the community because we are wired for relationship. But oftentimes it's the microculture. It's the things that are more felt. It's the things that, there's certain value systems and stuff that you don't necessarily see up front.
Right.
Well,
so a microculture that I was shocked by when we were first married was I went to a family event that he was having.
Yeah.
And
it's either Thanksgiving or Christmas.
Aunt and his uncles and his mom.
Yep.
And Kris was even involved in that.
Yeah.
And it was just like, they were just like talking over each other. Who could be the loudest is what it felt like. But it also felt like angry. I was like,
we were discussing.
My goodness. I was like, they're fighting.
No, we were just discussing.
I cannot believe what I was like,
it's so true.
I don't know what was happening. And so we got in the vehicle later that night and I was just.
Jesse's like wide-eyed, like just your eyes were just like, what did I do? You thought you like watched our family just blow up.
Yeah. And you're like, what's going on? And I'm like,
you okay?
You guys were fighting. I was like, is this normal? And he's just like, oh no, this was a great Thanksgiving. We had a great time with each other.
Yeah.
We were just discussing and we like to discuss loudly and even play devil's advocate on occasion. And
Right.
so I did not realize all of that.
It's very much a defend your position and justify it,
Yeah.
And it's war. It's total war. But
it's in all in good fun. Like truly.
Most of the time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it sure can cross lines, I'm sure.
It definitely crossed lines through the years, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I was raised with that value system. So that's a great example. Here's the thing is you grow up, and this is the thing. So when I say value, a lot of times we think, well, this is a right value or this is a wrong value.
No.
That's a terrible way to look at value sometimes.
Absolutely.
Now, obviously, there are transcendent truths. Thou shalt not murder, right? Shouldn't lie. Like, those are values you should have. Like,
Good thing I didn't marry into the mob.
Right. There are moral values.
Right.
So what I'm talking about is not morality. But here's the thing. Many times we mistake some values that we hold as moral values.
Right.
So if you believe that, well, I should be quiet and I should wait my turn, I should, well, yes, maybe no. Right? There's nothing necessarily moral about not offering your opinion.
Right.
There's nothing moral about offering your opinion necessarily. I mean,
Right.
I'm speaking very generally here.
Right.
Of course, how you do it and what heart you do things with matters, of course.
Right.
But the thing is like for you coming into that family environment, though, you there was a value that was being crossed where you just were like the way we were talking to each other. You weren't used to. You didn't see that in your family.
Well, because the Knowles are very loud.
Yeah.
But it's most of the time it's just in good fun. Like usually it's joking or it's card games or, so no one's really discussing loudly.
Right.
And they're definitely not talking over one another.
Yeah.
Usually.
Yeah.
Now I say usually because I know that there have been moments where they'll talk over someone else and interrupt. But for the most part, they try to wait their turn. And so I just didn't understand.
Yeah.
The interruptions and I felt like it was bulldozing almost.
Gotcha.
And so I really just didn't understand it. However, in our culture, in our home, we've kind of adopted Chris
a little bit
microculture. However, I mean, I think there's some things that we're trying to adapt in the sense of honoring one another and seeing where the other one's talking, respecting that.
And so, years ago, I had read this thing about, it was a missionary who had left, his native country, had gone to another country, and he made this observation. I believe it was Leslie Newbegin. And he made this observation where he said, when you leave your culture, many times you're so immersed in it that you don't even understand what those values are. Mm-hmm. And then you go to it. So he was a missionary, I believe, in India. And while he was over in India, all of a sudden you start critiquing right away.
Oh,
why do they do this way? Why do they, and you start kind of going after different things they value. Well, that's dumb or that's, and he said, that's really a terrible approach to have.
Yeah.
He said, because you need to really kind of get behind there's a reason why people do what they do. And it's not that you can never assess another culture or sometimes there are better ways of doing things, but all of us can come into an environment with a pretty judgmental attitude. And one of the things he said was he had never evaluated his own community, his own culture, and he started to see value systems in this new culture that he was immersed in that made him actually critique his own culture. And I would say this, like for you and I, when we got married, because you started bringing up some of these things that I just thought were natural. It's kind of like, a fish only knows a culture of water. Oh, sure. But take the fish out of the water and all of a sudden they recognize, hey, this is different, right? Get me back to, and if you spend any amount of time just over in another culture, you can almost feel like a fish out of water and it exposes you to things you never thought about before. And there was something about, getting married, leaving my home and all of this that as you and I were building this, because here's the thing, when a marriage comes together, you're building a culture.
Absolutely.
And you're bringing value systems and I'm bringing value systems. And even though we had a lot of things in common, there were still a lot of things that we needed to sort out.
Well, and we needed our microcultures to merge.
Absolutely.
And melt into each other.
Yeah.
I mean, it's similar to American culture where I feel like there's a ton of different cultures around. And honestly, I think as Americans, we should try to understand other cultures even within the U.S., but also there should be a molding, a melting to it as well.
And that's the great American experiment. That's what we have said. We've said we're a melting pot. And I mean, and there are things that come along that expose maybe we're not as much,
right,
or maybe the melting pot has several clumps in it, right. That are harder to break down. But the thing is like when it comes down to it, in our marriage, I would say a lot of the conflicts, a lot of the things that were happening were, if you had a value that I didn't share, then here's the deal. When I violate that value, who feels it?
Me.
You do.
Yeah.
Do I feel it if I don't have that value? No. And see, here's one of the problems when it comes to...
unless I'm yelling at you about it.
Then I feel, what is your deal? Why is she so bent out of shape? No, but absolutely. So here's the thing. And a lot of times, especially in marriage, you marry this person, you get involved with them and stuff, and all of a sudden, maybe it's a toilet seat rule, right? Right,
always put it down.
Jesse's got a rule: always put it down. And I'm like, well, you can put it down just as easily as me. I didn't have that value, and so if Jesse came in and saw the toilet seat up, well, I violated that value. So here's the deal: the key to marriage is, and that seems like a pretty silly example, but the reality is that you got to come to agreement on some of these things. Now you got to choose your battles.
Absolutely.
Because not everything's going to change overnight. But the thing of it is you have to really start analyzing where are those micro culture lines.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times we just assume, well, I feel this value, so you need to feel it.
Right.
Yard work would be another one. Yeah. Yard work is way higher on the list for you than it is for me.
Absolutely.
Like I mow the lawn, knock down the weeds. I'm good with that, right? Whereas you would have a value system that says, no, I want things to look nicer than they do. I want us to put a little bit more, effort into it and stuff.
It doesn't have to look like the professional lawn, the one that gets like the award.
Someone's out there with like little scissors in the yard clipping individual blades of grass, not that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But the reality is like that's just another area where we've kind of had conflict of like, here's the deal. You feel that way, but I don't necessarily feel it.
Right.
So what do we do at that point? How do we come to an agreement?
I think just having just healthy discussion of just like, hey, well, this means a lot to me because one, it'll help the value of the house.
Yeah.
So when we do go to sell, which may be years down the road, but when we do go to sell, then we won't have to be putting a ton of work into it at that point.
Yeah.
But we've already developed some things.
Yeah.
That hopefully will help this house look more curb appeal.
Yeah.
Have more curb appeal.
Yeah.
And so it's not necessarily that you have to all of a sudden really desire an amazing yard, but just that you're willing to help, you know, that when I ask for a Saturday that you're like, yeah, I can give you a Saturday, morning from this time to this time and help you do whatever you need done.
Well, and I want to take it back to our families and we're speaking in a real general, real broad way here. I don't want to, we're not going to single anybody out or point fingers or anything like that, but I would say just stepping back and looking at it, I would say your family probably had a lot of a kind of a peacekeeper mentality, right? Hey, don't rock the boat. Let's just try it, go along to get along,
Absolutely.
And I want to just acknowledge there are there are ways that can be helpful and that can be beneficial, right?
Right. Where your family is very truth-telling.
Direct.
And very direct.
Confrontational.
So,
we're going to settle this now.
Honestly, it's been kind of a refreshing.
Yeah.
Because having that microculture, I feel like I can even talk to your parents in that way, not in a disrespectful manner.
Right.
I still want to honor their position, but
you feel the freedom to really say how you feel.
Right. And they do value it.
Yeah.
They value it and they show that it's important to hear. And so I just think that it's good that it's like we've kind of learned how to mold those a little bit where not everything needs to be a big to do, but yet there are things that we do need to discuss and be very honest with one another. And I think that kind of brings us to furnace because I think without truth telling, I don't think you can really get to the furnace.
No.
Because if you're always joyful, I think it's the go along to get along type of culture that it's like we're just not. But I think if you're really being honest though, if you just go along to get along, at some point something's going to blow up.
Yeah.
Because there's just things that come up. And if you just keep bowing to whatever is bothering you, eventually that's going to come to a head and it's going to be ugly. Whereas in a truth culture where there's more furnace moments, right, but they're not cranking up the heat all the way to 100
and all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's a, you know, you're putting it on simmer and then every once in a while you're turning it up a little bit where it doesn't ever get to the boiling point. Well,
and it's good that you mentioned that, because I would say that the difference between our families, you know, would be, just again speaking in a general way, you know, your family's tendency might be to maybe more sweep things under the rug. We just got to move on and don't worry about that, and let's not have conflict and all that. And again,
it doesn't mean that they don't tell the truth.
No,
but
I can honor the peacekeeping side of things, right? Yeah. On my side, though, the weakness is we can turn everything into an issue.
Right.
Like we're just going to come to blows over anything. Like, I disagree with you. Let's debate, you know, and it's like, well, you know, how useful is that really? We're giving a lot of energy to things. I mean, I've looked back on things, and this is one of those things, stepping out, being married to you and stepping away from my own culture a little bit has made me look back and go, wow, has my family really sweated the small stuff on some things?
Well, and even I think early on in our marriage, it was like that.
Like, we got to be 100% in agreement on toothpaste brand. No.
Yeah. But kind of. I mean,
you don't like Colgate?
It's like, it just
or Crest or whatever.
Funny, like, because you look back and it's like, I don't remember half of our arguments or what they were about. And it's like, if it was that important, you'd think I'd remember at least something. But I think we did. We just kind of cranked it up and just tried to speak truth to each other. And it's like, sometimes to the detriment of the other person.
Well, so I want to close with this, you know, and we'll pick up more. We'll talk about just having difficult conversations, what are key ingredients and things like that. But I will say this, walking away, the takeaways from this conversation, you know, this podcast today is, number one, you got to recognize macro and micro cultures. Yeah. Macro is easy to spot, but the micro is like, what are those values? What are those things that are felt that aren't often discussed? And what are things that you feel that you don't, maybe you haven't even verbalized? You know, that's so important. That's number one. But then at the same time, I'll just close with this thought, because you talked about this a little bit about turning up the heat. A gentleman by the name of Heifetz, he's well known in the leadership community. I think, like, you know, done some Harvard business reviews and things like that. Yeah. He wrote a book called Leadership on the Line, and he talks about exactly about how even in organizational leadership, and I would say even in marriage, you need the moments, you need people who will turn up the heat.
Absolutely.
Because as an organization, if you never tackle the hard things, if you never discuss those eggshell issues, you'll stop growing. And at some point, there will be a blow up. Yeah. At some point, there will be something that breaks down because we didn't correct this. And if you let things go, they turn into a cancer. They end up metastasizing and then end up blowing up and causing way more damage than had you just taken the time to do that. Now, the trick is, and Heifetz talks about, you got to be able to turn up the heat and then keep it at a steady temperature. And this is where, like, my upbringing, we didn't do this well, because, and we kind of brought this even in our marriage, was we'd turn up the heat, make everything an issue, and then it's boiling over.
Right.
And then, well, that's not doing anybody any good, and it's actually causing damage. So there's a spot where we want to turn up. We don't want to sweep issues under the rug. We don't want eggshell issues. But as we turn up the heat, there is that sweet spot. And then there's a time of like, okay, let's cool it down.
Right. Yeah.
You know, come back to affirmation, come back to,
absolutely,
you know, building each other up.
There's those moments where you've turned it up.
Yeah.
And then you're like, you can't come to an agreement right at that moment. Yeah. And so there is that timeout. We need to turn it down. We both need to go to our places and kind of
regroup,
reevaluate, and even reevaluate where our stance is, and see if there's some wisdom in what the other one is presenting. Because I think when, like what you were saying, just about the furnace causes us to grow.
Yeah.
I think if we're unwilling to grow, I think that's really sad. Yeah. I think part of being in existence in the world is becoming a better version of yourself.
Absolutely.
And becoming better. And if it happens in the furnace, you kind of have to be willing to come back to those conversations after evaluating your own position and being willing to submit some things to the other person.
Well, and let's not forget, the furnace is the place where refining happens.
Yeah.
That's the place where gold is made. We need heat to be turned up in our lives. We do need appropriate confrontation. Yeah. And we'll talk about spaces of grace and all that kind of stuff and how those things look at in future episodes. But just the takeaway from today is this idea of recognizing the microculture, the macro, and understanding, how do I show up?
Yeah.
Am I the person? Here's the thing, that Shimogatsu quote is, on the one hand, many of us like the joy of community.
Yeah.
Are you someone who only focuses on the joy and happy and all? That's great. But you could be creating a superficial environment.
Sure.
Where people aren't really being honest.
Yeah.
Right. At the same time, furnace. Are you the truth teller? Are you the one who says, no, we really need to figure this out? And the thing of it is, we need both those things.
Absolutely.
We need both those things in our families. We need both those things in our organizations. And we need those things for ourselves as well. So, figure that out. So that's kind of kicking off this series of difficult conversations. How do we do that? And there we go. There's an episode in the can, right. Jesse. So thank you so much for joining us. Yes. Hey, remember to like and subscribe to this podcast and give us a 5-star review because you want to. We'd even take a 4-star, but 3s and below, no, come on.
We're amazing.
At least we think we are. So, hey, once again, thanks for checking us out, and we'll see you next time.